Quest for King Arthur. I'm the King Arthur guy, and this is episode 12. I know I said that I was going to stop after episode 11, but I thought of something else I thought I wanted to talk about. Besides, an even dozen is a better number of episodes anyway. So first of all, I want to clear up a mistake I made way back in episode 2 when I said that the Britons made a linguistic distinction between the forts that the Romans made, which they referred to as Chester, and the forts they made themselves, which they called in their own language of Din. Actually, I was wrong about that. Chester was not what the Britons called them. That comes from the Anglo-Saxons, so that's a mistake on my part, but you know, we all make mistakes. Anyway, the bulk of this is a result of an argument I got into on the internet. I know that's a bad idea to get into arguments on the internet, but it struck me that I perhaps haven't made myself clear as to what I'm doing and how what I'm doing is different from what everybody else is doing. Okay, so I want to look at a specific example, and this is with the figure of Riothamus, which I think I mentioned him, but I certainly didn't make a big issue out of him. Riothamus came from Brittany. All the information we have on him comes from the year 470. And Riothamus means most royal. So there's a school of thought that says that this is actually a title, not a name. And of course, this also connects to Vortigern, because Vortigern means supreme king, so there are those who argue that that is also a title, not a name. So the gist of the argument was that everyone is entitled to their own interpretation. This was what the other person was arguing on. And that's an oversimplification. People are only entitled to their own interpretation under certain circumstances. For example, flat earthers are not entitled to their interpretation of science. What they are saying is just wrong. Okay, and they're not entitled to say things that are factually wrong. So this is my first issue with this emphasis on interpretation in Britain in this context, is that quite often opinions are presented as facts. When I first started studying this time period, I was studying the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the way in which it was divided up. And I didn't have any intention of doing a deep dive into Britain itself. And had I stopped where I originally intended to stop, I would have come away with the impression that Riothamus and Vortigern were titles and that this was an established fact, because that's the way it was presented to me in the first couple of historians that I read. It's only later, when I started to look into it in more detail, that I discovered, no, this is an opinion. Opinion should never be presented as fact. What should actually happen is people should say, well, some people think these are titles, some people think these are names, I think it's, let's say title, and here's why. Okay, that's how it should be presented. In order to avoid confusion, because historians, whether professional or amateurs, have an obligation to present accurate information. So no, they don't have the right to pretend that an opinion is an objective fact. That's breaking with their obligation. Okay, now the second thing I want to get into is that in a number of different situations, including the one we're talking about, this doesn't have to be subject to interpretation. We can figure out the right answer, and it's often quite easy if you just go through the motions. And I've seen historians studying other things who do what I'm about to do. This is why I find it so bizarre that nobody studying Britain in this time period is doing this. Nobody except me, anyway. You go over all of the information you have in detail and try and get the right answer. That's not what's happening. So, first of all, we need to define how many options we have. So we have the two terms, Riothamus and Vortigern. So option number one is that they're both titles. Option number 2 is that they're both names. Option number 3 is that Vortigern is a name and Riothamus is a title. Option number 4 is that Riothamus is a name and Vortigern is a title. Now, true, the last 2 options are a little far-fetched. Chances are, if one of them's a title, then they're both titles, and if one of them's a name, then they're both names. However, you should always keep your mind open to things that are unlikely, because every once in a while, something that's unlikely does turn out to be the truth. Not in this case, however, but it does sometimes happen. So don't close it off entirely. Now, the next step is to verify that all of these options are actually viable. You'd be surprised how many times people put forward an interpretation that doesn't have any chance of working in the real world. Now, in this case, they are both viable. There are examples of monarchs who are known by their titles, not their names. Genghis Khan is a very famous example. That's his title. His name was Temujin. Okay. There are also examples of names that look like titles. Vercingetorix, Julius Caesar's enemy in Gaul. It means over warrior king. It looks like a title, but it was his name. Okay, so it's all possible. Next thing we do is gather up all the information we have, and in this case there isn't very much, and go over it minutely to try to determine the right answer. Okay, so we have 3 primary sources. The Ruin and Conquest of Britain by Gildas, written sometime around the year 540, which is a religious book that has history in it. We have the British History, written in 830, which is a very short book, but still a history. And we have the Welsh Annals, written about 100 years or so later. Okay, so we go through all of these sources, paying very close attention to how they use titles and how they use names. Right. In order for these to have been titles, they would have to have emphasized titles over names. No, they very clearly emphasized names over titles. The only examples I could find, I think there was only 2 of them, in which an individual was referred to by the title and not the name, the person was not the subject of the sentence. When he was the subject of the sentence, occasionally they would include both the name and the title. But the overwhelming majority of the time, they just referred to him by name, indicating that they emphasized names over titles, not titles over names. But these names have meanings. Yes, of course. So we can easily fit this into what has already been established, what is generally accepted about their nomenclature. I mentioned this earlier. Names, in an earlier episode, names trigger associations. They trigger emotional responses. And the ancient Britons and medieval Welsh used this to their own purposes. Using names that had particular meanings intended in order to send certain messages and trigger deliberate responses. There's even some evidence that some of these men changed their names in order to do this. Cadfal, for example, the first Cadfal on record was a 7th century king of Gwynedd who came to power in a civil war. He seized the throne through battle. Cadfal means battle Caesar. Okay. Furthermore, as I pointed out in an earlier episode, we also have evidence that there were times when they would avoid using names in order to avoid triggering such responses. Because of the low level of literacy, Gildas's book was intended to be recited in front of audiences. He referred to the Anglo-Saxons by name only once, and he included a direction to whoever was giving the recitation. Name not to be spoken. Don't trigger the response. Okay, so this shows an emphasis not only on names, but the effect that names have. Then you could easily see how a name like Supreme King, Vortigern, would be a name. It was picked to send a particular message. Riothamus, again, most royal. It's sending a message. There's also another piece of information which I should have brought up, which is that we know that there were 2 Vortigerns. Vortigern means Supreme King, which means if it was a title, it was a title for the High King or the man at the top of the system. But The second Vortigern, who came about 100 years after the first one, was not a significant king at all. Now, people who say that these were titles, who are aware of this second Vortigern, say, oh, well, it started as a title, but then it turned into a name, which undercuts their argument, because their whole argument is this has to be a title because it looks like a title, but then they're turning around and admitting that it was also used as a name. So then how do they know it was a title merely because it looks like a title? No, the evidence is very clear. These were names, which means that these theories that say that, you know, it doesn't happen with Vortigern, because with Vortigern it's pretty straightforward. It's Riothamus. They try to connect him with other significant figures and say Riothamus was his title, whereas his name was something else. But once you do the research and you find out how they actually viewed titles and names, and then you know, no, Riothamus was his name. He was not this, same as somebody else. He was Riothamus, and these other figures were separate. Okay, so that is an example of what I'm talking about, but the underlying issue is the way in which the history is being investigated. Everybody else is emphasizing their interpretations, but I don't care about interpretations. I only interpret when I absolutely have to. I'm much more interested in trying to reconstruct as accurately as possible, as much as I possibly can, about this time period. So when I get into an argument with someone on the internet and they're saying, "Oh, this is just your interpretation," no. When it's my interpretation, I say it's my interpretation. If I say such and such a thing is true, it's because I've reasoned through to that logical conclusion from fact. So you can't just dismiss what I'm saying, well, as an interpretation. Well, you could, but you'd be wrong. No, you're going to have to show where I made a mistake with my reasoning, how I got the information wrong. But nobody else is operating on like that. Everybody else is just, well, it's my interpretation, so I'm entitled to do whatever I want. I don't agree with that. I don't like that. I mean, we're supposed to be trying to figure out what really happened, but by definition, you can't do that with interpretation. Because if something can be interpreted one way, it can be interpreted at least one other way, so there's no empirical reason to choose one interpretation over another. I want situations where there are empirical reasons to choose one interpretation over another. And if I don't have that, then I just openly admit that this is an opinion, or, I can't tell what really happened. I don't say such and such a thing must be the truth and I'm entitled to my interpretation. No, I don't do that. And I don't think anybody else should be doing it that way either. Although you could say that that's just my interpretation. However, I would argue that my way is more effective. If I'm putting forward an argument and that's based on reason and backed up by fact, isn't that a heck of a lot stronger than just saying, well, this is my interpretation and I'm entitled to it? It all depends upon what you're trying to do. And as I said, I'm trying to find as much of an accurate reconstruction as I possibly can. So I'm not indulging my imagination. Anyway, this is finally the last episode, and if you've gotten through to the end, I thank you, and you might want to leave a like and maybe a comment, and maybe show this to somebody else, or anyway, goodbye.